I think we've got a lot of great work that we're going to see this afternoon. And if you can text people and tell them that the lecture's starting. So we're very fortunate today. We have Graham Haworth with us today. Graham is the co-founding director of Haworth Tompkins Architects and has more than 30 years of experience developing and leading cultural and education projects. He has led projects for the National Portrait Gallery, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the London Library, Kingston University, and the Royal College of Art. Haworth has also developed the studio's urban regeneration portfolio, designing buildings at Liverpool 1 for Grosvenor Estates. Did I say that right? Yeah. Watch that. Hallsville Quarter for Hughes UK, Showham Manor, the Olympic Athens Village, and the multi-award-winning Coin Street development on London South Bank. Haworth has lectured and been a visiting critic at a number of leading schools of architecture, including Cambridge University in the UK and Yale University. He has contributed to a number of publications and television programs on architecture, such as The Art Show, Dream Spaces, and Buildings That Shaped Britain. Haworth has an interest in contemporary art, advising on public art procurement and production, and has collaborated with Turner prize-winning artist Martin Creed, Greenville Davy, and American artist Dan Grant. Okay, so that's the official bio. Always saves reading these things, but you gotta do it. So, very fortunate, and I feel lucky to be able to introduce Graham. I only actually met Graham today for the first time, but looking at the work of Haworth Tompkins Architects, I'm very excited to have him here with us to share very cutting-edge contemporary work in the UK. I should also mention that the firm won the Sterling Prize in 2014, which is the top prize in the UK for architecture. It's kind of the gold medal of the AIA here in the States. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Graham, and thanks.
Great. Well, I hope you like The Fall. If we were a band, I think we'd be The Fall, but we weren't talented enough to do work of that sort of clarity. So we ended up in architecture instead. Much of our work is about adaptation and transformation, which is what the title of this talk's about, really. We've never been fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to have a blank canvas to work from. We've always had constraints, be they contextual constraints or political constraints, and most of our work is in very severe urban conditions in London. It's an area that we've chosen to work in. We're very comfortable with that, and when we started the practice, we always wanted to work in a real setting and real environment. So this is just a picture of London, really. We wanted to practice in an area that we could engage with, and I think the stuff that I'm going to show is really about a line of inquiry and a working methodology. It's not really about how to make award-winning buildings or be a successful practitioner particularly. It's about a creative process. And we're very interested in the density of cities and the saturated space that you get in various cities around the world. I mean, this just happens to be a picture of San Francisco, the Mission District, which I took in the early 80s, and it was already layer upon layer of stuff and junk. And this area is a sort of rich sort of capsule, really, for us to take inspiration from. We also like the idea of a city being so layered that over time you don't pick up the subtleties of the subversiveness that goes on in it. So in this illustration, for example, immediately above the whiskey advert is a hoarding by conceptual artist Joseph Kossuth. And the idea that you can have an artwork in a city and the density and the layering somehow gets mingled together is really inspirational for us, because we tend to find ourselves working in this sort of saturated, dense urban space a lot. This picture is a real favorite of mine. It's a little bit provocative with the dog turd on the pavement, but it's really a building by Michael Manson, who used to work for Frank Gehry, and he did the temporary contemporary in Queens for MoMA. And it's a photograph that not many architects would take, really. They want the spruced up, high gloss version, the hi-fi version of city dwelling, and really it's not quite like that. It's much more complex. You have to deal with the junk of everyday reality, and that's the sort of context that we find ourselves working in. And another really interesting touchstone for us is the early work of Frank Gehry. While he's still a fantastic architect and still incredibly interesting, he was phenomenally interesting at this period, where he had notions that you could create an architecture which you almost had to bump into before you realized that it was a work of architecture. And this idea of the temporary and the provisional is something that we think we've tapped into in our own work. He used to, at those days, write papers called Getting Tough with Economics and The Dumb Box, and just trying to create buildings out of nothing before he became the Frank Gehry that we know today. He also was really instrumental in some approaches to found space and interventions that work with found space that is provisional and open to change. This is the temporary contemporary in Los Angeles, which they built while they were building the Isazaki Museum. And in some ways, it was more successful. And it was quite pioneering at that time to see this building for us. Lina Bobardi is another inspiration in terms of the adaptation of existing structures and issues that deal with cultural memory. What do buildings become when they adapt and the previous uses and the previous owners and occupiers move on? And we've also taken a lot of influence from theatre director Peter Brook. He was a master of carving new spaces into old existing theatres, and the more decrepit they were, the more successful they were from his point of view. This is a picture of the BAM Majestic in Brooklyn, but he also did a theatre in Paris called the Buda North, and he had an experimental theatre group that also inhabited those spaces. On the more tech side, we've also been very influenced by early Norman Foster buildings. I don't know what it is about us. We tend to like people's earlier work rather than their later work, but this is a factory that he did. And at this time, he was interested in doing more with less, and the idea of technology being something that you could make a link between people and ideas, and the idea of transfer technology, using technologies that exist in other industries to influence architecture. And this had parallels with an architect called Cedric Price. It's a slightly out of focus image, but this is a building called the Kentish Town Interaction Centre in London. And it was a framework, a device for creating spaces and creating architectural settings that could change and adapt over time. And he used to use phrases like open systems and generators to create three-dimensional space. We're also interested in areas in the margins of mainstream work. This is an MIT graduate called Michael Rakovitz, where he created these shelters, inflatable shelters for homeless, which you tap into the air extracts to create the inflatable nature and also the warmth that was needed in them. And he was an MIT graduate. And there's something about working at this outside mainstream architecture, which we're very interested in. It's also resonating recently. This is quite an old piece, but it's also resonating with the maker movement in the States now, which is really beginning to sort of take hold. The people that can actually take hold of their own designs and their own destinies rather than being subject to a product that's just for sale. And I think digital technology has assisted in that progress. We've also been interested in the low end of it, the lo-fi aspect of work and creative work. And we were very influenced by punk and the idea of fanzines and ready-mades and things that you just needed some paper and a photocopier in order to make a message, to make a statement, and it had very low production values. And again, that seems to us to capture more energy than a lot of overproduced work that architects feel they need to produce. We collaborate a lot with artists. We're interested not in things that you just put up on your wall, but the fact that art can act as a provocateur, that it can create conversations and energies that unlock thinking. And some of the collaborations we've done have been going on for several years. We've done several projects with Martin Creed, who won the Turner Prize. This is a piece of his called Half the Air in a Given Space. The clue's in the title. So half the air is in the balloons and half of it is left in the space. And this is a piece that you can actually get inside and walk around through the balloons. And it opened up avenues for us about what artists do in the way that architects don't. Architects have to compromise in the way that artists don't necessarily have to. And artists are always trying to look at the line of inquiry that they're trying to pursue in terms of their conceptual approach. There's also a very interesting way that artists record their work, which I think architects don't record their work in quite the same formal and rigorous way that artists do in terms of cataloging and really just the lineage of production. This is a piece we collaborated on with Martin in Scotland. It's called Scotsman Steps. It's an old Victorian structure. It's a project that shouldn't really have happened. It's 150 steps that link Waverley Street Bridge down to the station. And it was in the Scotsman's newspaper building, and it was an old decrepit structure, but it was listed, and it's also a public highway. And this idea is that it was reclad in a marble carpet. So there are 150 steps, all made out of completely different marble. And it's been a hugely successful way of introducing an artwork into a public realm that actually does something and actually regenerates and adapts the existing condition. We started our practice in 1991, so we're in our 25th year now. We started by myself and Steve Tompkins. When we started, we were in the middle of a downturn. It was most architects were doing commercial works, office spaces and banks, and it was the idea that the financial services industry would provide our future, so we were providing lots of space for them. We had very little work to begin with. I think we spent this first 6 months designing our letterhead. That was our biggest project, and then slowly began to pick up. There was a lot of direct action work at that time. People were actually getting out on the streets a lot more and complaining that they didn't have the necessities that they needed, such as housing. And we had two big breaks at this point. One was a competition-winning housing scheme for the Coin Street Group, which were a local housing group right on the South Bank, just behind the River Thames. And we created this courtyard housing scheme for 59 dwellings around a central garden. And this was a scheme that was a product of a community action to stop a wholesale redevelopment of this site with new office buildings. And it's now a place for people to live in the centre of the city. So all the old docks and industries were changing, but people still wanted to live in the communities that they've been brought up in. So this provided them with a way of staying in the neighbourhood, and collaborations with local employers meant that they had places to work as well. We completed a neighbourhood centre to close off the square, which contains community facilities such as a creche and various neighbourhood centres. And then slowly our housing developed over time, and we're now involved in a lot of quite large-scale urban regeneration in London. We're involved in schemes from about 300 to 500 residential units, and some of them are quite controversial. It's a big hot topic in London at the moment, housing, and it's a subject that's probably another talk. But we're involved in several different schemes that involve regeneration of 1960s housing estates, tower blocks, all the mistakes of our architectural predecessors we're involved in some way or other trying to rectify. And this idea of sort of adaptability and change over time is something that we've brought to bear on the housing from an interest in other cultural activities. The other big break that happened at that similar sort of time in the late 90s, early 80s for us was the competition to design a renovation of the Royal Court Theatre in Sloane Square. This was basically a Victorian music hall, which over time had become a sort of hotbed for radical theatre. And at the time, it was run by Stephen Daldry. And it raised issues for us about how you change buildings, how you renovate them and restore them or adapt them, but keep their essential character, so that when people revisit the Royal Court, having been away for a couple of years, they go back to the Royal Court Theatre. It's not like we're starting with a tabula rasa and clearing away the cultural memories of the buildings themselves. So this was our first sort of foray into additions to buildings in a completely contemporary way, but also looking at ways that buildings can be peeled back. And we looked at found space, found junctions and found materials within these buildings, and in some of the areas we just left it quite raw, and then inserted new additions adjacent to that. So this is also one of the first collaborations with an artist. There's a red drum wall which creates the auditorium wall, and we worked with an artist called Anthony Malinescu there, who we subsequently worked on several projects with. So these early projects really defined the direction that we took and the projects that I'm going to show you in a second. we're still very interested in although our projects are getting larger and our practice is now up to 60 architects, we feel we're right on the limit of being able to control that. But we're still very interested in projects that are smaller and temporary and provisional. And this is a building that punches way above its weight. It's a temporary theatre outside the National Theatre on the South Bank. We call it, it's a red shed. It's made out of timber. It was only meant to be there for 12 months, and it's now in its third year of existence. And we built it while we were doing a bigger project on the back of the theatre for a new production space. And these buildings you can have a lot of fun with. They're very cheap, they're very economic, they go up very quickly, and because they're temporary and provisional, people somehow tend to relax a lot more about the work than they would if it was a permanent structure that was going to be there for a while. And this was another similar structure we did for a big writer's studio up in Suffolk for a group called Aldborough Music. And again, this was a core 10 structure, prefabricated off-site. We wanted to bring the building down the river. The site is right next to a river, and we wanted to bring it in on a barge and lift it into place. But we weren't allowed to do that for health and safety reasons. But we did, in fact, managed to lift it in one piece into the existing ruin of the old dovecot, which forms the base of it. So that's sort of what, by way of context, really. The four buildings that I just want to talk about in some detail all work within this context of adaptation and transformation, and they all work in this this situation of what we call saturated space. I think all cities have it. London has it in bucket loads, really. The density of bridges, the density of Victorian infrastructure, signage, chaos, all the junk that I mentioned earlier we're having to deal with. And there's also this idea of building over somebody else's history. So often you get buildings where the Victorian heritage has been overpainted and seeps through, and you get this layer and layer of complexity, and the building becomes a sort of story in itself. So these are a series of projects that deal with those themes. The first one is a temporary theatre we did for the Almeida in King's Cross. They were renovating the main production house up in Islington, and they acquired this old bus depot which sat in the middle of an urban block. It formed a very interesting configuration of spaces, and the main auditorium we put on a single rake and managed to squeeze it into this sort of corner point here. And the access to the site is through here. So all the warehouses were left intact, and we created a bar and front of house reception space and the main auditorium stage. And the configuration of the buildings put the audience in a very strange juxtaposition with the actors and the stage. And they were almost sitting in the roof trusses of the existing building, which we maintained and renovated. And this is the setting. So in the middle of the urban block, right next to Tony's hemp bar and the adult video exchange, sort of really defines the sort of context that we find ourselves working in a lot. And it's a case of how do you react to that? Do you try and create a new setting? Do you work with it? And often, because of the things I've described earlier, we tend to work with it. So we created the theatre space at the end of an alleyway. And this is also the first time we were beginning to experiment with almost in the way that Venturi would sign a building, that a building is almost a billboard, that you can put a name on it. And it seems really crass, but just adding the word theatre at the end of that yellow polycarbonate wall somehow explains the iconography of the building. And it's something that we developed on other projects. So color and graphics are really important in terms of the way that we bring them into our work. And I think at architecture school, it's something that almost never exists. It never seems to take place in the designs. But I'd encourage you to use it as a really key design component. And because the building is a nighttime activity, it was almost this case of creating illusionary spaces that come alive at night. So the use of really strong colors and strong graphics work with the setting. And then the stage in this particular configuration, because it was found space, we had to shoehorn in the auditorium, cram people in right up against the roof trusses, and it created this really amazing juxtaposition and intimacy between the stage immediately to the left and the audience. And it could be quite intimidating to see shows there, but it actually created by using the space as we found it, created a tension that we wouldn't ordinarily have managed to procure, I don't think. The rest of the building was just sort of cheap and cheerful. It was plastic and paint, copious amounts of projection lights, signage and mirrors. And again, this image, I think, is very similar to the early Geary photograph I showed you. And it's just amazing to find these spaces. And they're becoming more and more difficult to find now. The more urban regeneration that goes on in London, the more difficult these spaces are to actually get hold of. This was actually subsequently demolished for a housing scheme about a year after we finished the project. We had to be inventive with the way we spent our budget as well. A lot of this work is not expensive, and a lot of our clients don't have a lot of money at this level. So we virtually had to find creative ways of solving technical solutions. So the roof acoustics in the theatre are quite important, not only in terms of noise ingress into an auditorium, which you have to insulate, but also noise from the auditorium breaking out. So we literally borrowed this grass roof and clad the whole of the asbestos shed in a garden, about 1.5 foot thick. And then when we finished the project and the building was dismantled, we basically gave the garden back to the guy who'd lent it to us. So it was an extremely sustainable approach to acoustic separation. This is another theatre in London, which draws on some of the themes that we used at the Almeida. It was designed originally in the 70s, and it was just a series of very simple spaces. There was a prefabricated auditorium at that end, which had a steel frame and a blockwork enclosure. There was a retained 3-story structure in the center of the site, which has an old butcher's shop in the bottom of it. And then there was a small breeze block office building for front of house and administrative uses. And basically, this is a really good example of how much work can you do on a building before it becomes something else. So the plan configuration of our proposal literally kept the auditorium broadly where it was. We decided to retain the central shop that was there before, make a bigger cafe and front of house space, and create 2 studio spaces next to it. But essentially, a lot of people questioned whether we'd actually done anything to the building by the time we'd finished, other than wrap it with something on the outside, which was, to us, was quite an indictment of what we'd achieved. You can see the central axis of the auditorium there. It doesn't change in the new proposal. We simply made it wider and bigger, and we kept the butcher's shop in the center. We put another story on the building and created a double-height foyer space, and then created the 2 rehearsal spaces adjacent to it. And this is just a sequence of that. So essentially, it was the same building, totally demolished and rebuilt apart from the shop in the center, and did very similar things to what the existing building did, but did them in a better way. So we managed to sort of create this sequence of spaces from the auditorium up to the first floor foyer, and then the roof space where the offices were, and finally capped it off. And from the outside, we basically put back what had been there before and kept the shop and the cultural memory of the shop. There was another reason why the shop hadn't been demolished in the early proposal, and that was because it got hit during the war with a bomb, and there was a lot of bodies underneath the shop that they never managed to recover. So it was kept as a memorial. And again, that was another issue for us not changing it. And in a way, the building's quite plain and non-assertive. And it relies on the work that goes in it and the audience to actually bring it alive. So you literally switch it on at night, and then it comes into something else. There's a large yellow drum wall, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. And then by just the use of the word theatre again, we're somehow branding the fact that it is a theatre, just in case people don't know. The auditorium functions a lot better than it does. It holds more seats. It has a technical grid above it, which it didn't have before, and it's acoustically a better space. So we've increased the longevity of the building, and with very selective use of color and reflectivity, we've made the building have an energy that the old one didn't have. And it's the users of the building that actually make the building come alive at night. There's an external terrace, so people come and inhabit that. And in many ways, the building's just doing what the previous one did, but it's doing it in a different way, a better way. And the idea that somehow you can use the building by opening it up, you can create the city, you can bring the city in, so you're blurring the boundary between the inside and the outside. And we used a similar effect on the textured brickwork on the other side of the building as well, to create this really dramatic backdrop. So the building itself acts as a billboard with theatre posters, and what it's missing, it's just missing a bit of graffiti, I think. And if we could get that, I think we'd be very, very happy with it. The sign for the Wilson Brothers store was kept, and we put the theatre sign underneath, and that creates the sort of cultural connection with the previous building. And then the found space of the old shop was also retained. So all the tiling that used to be in the existing shop was retained and peeled back in places. A new staircase inserted on one side, and then this really shiny reflective ceiling to bring this real sense of theatricality to the interior. And we just patched up places. We didn't want to sort of blur the boundary between the old and the new. We wanted to patch up the scar tissue of the old and keep the existing fabric exactly as it was. One of the main components of the external facade was this collaboration we did with the painter Clem Crosby. He painted about 120 weatherboard panels by hand with this really gloopy yellow paint. And then they were all assembled together on the outside of the auditorium to create this really strong object. And we then clad that over with an open perforated mesh to create this double layered skin, and then shone light up the inside of that. So these are none of the panels are the same. They're all completely individual. And they're fixed into place from behind and weather sealed. So this forms the weather-tight skin. And then the metalwork is applied on the outside. We pioneered this detail with an English firm, an English fabricator called James and Taylor, and then got completely ripped off by Sana, who literally took the same detail and built the museum in Manhattan. I don't know whether many people know it, but we never got any credit for that at all, which in a way is part of the sort of punk attitude that you can rip people off, I suppose, and not worry about it. So we're quite cool about it. But it's proved to be a very robust material, and because of the light dynamics, it changes during the day. We took a section of it, literally a section of the building. The theatre allowed us to take it down, and we took it over to Venice for the Biennale, the David Chipperfield curated Biennale called Common Ground a couple of years ago. 4 years ago, I think now. And the theme was about different responses to urban conditions. So we thought we'd transpose part of our building into the Arsenale, and then we created this sort of booth of stuff. So all the stuff in the saturated space that I mentioned earlier that you find in streets and in really gritty urban cities, we forensically body bagged, basically. Jake Tilson, an artist we work with a lot on, particularly on graphics, spent 3 weeks going around the area collecting pointy fingers, cables, bits of old phone, and putting them into these sort of forensic crime scene bags. And we put that as an installation in the middle of the work to show how we use that as an influence, and that was the context that the building was designed to respond to. This is a much bigger project for the Royal College of Art, but deals on a slightly bigger scale with some of the themes. It has our trademark old bus depot as a starting point, which we changed. And it was a competition winning entry. The college liked the work we'd done at the Young Vic, but asked if they could have one which was a bit more well-made and a bit more permanent, which I thought was quite an interesting brief. And they ran a limited competition, which we won. And the original concept was to create these 3 lines of buildings, each with a void between, and then a strong, formal corner to the street for the main entrance, and then a series of atria spaces between them. The building was designed to be phased, so in the end, we built this outer section to secure the street, and then we built the painting school here, which we didn't build a new building in the end. We renovated an existing factory building that was on site. So we demolished the bus depot and built a new structure here. And then this third phase we've just recently completed last autumn. And it takes 4 different faculties of painting, photography, metalwork, and ceramics and glass. And it's been really fascinating seeing how different creative individuals work and how they vary in attitude and approach. Painters are the most anarchic. They totally trash everything that you let them near. Photographers just tend to sit around and talk a lot, so they don't need the same sort of studio space, but they have a lot of high-end production gear, such as digital printers and sort of light boxes and processing pieces. The metalwork, at the end, they're very precise, and the ceramics and glass, they're a little bit like painters. They chuck stuff around a lot. And the way that the building's organized is that we created this 3-story structure on the street, a central, what we call a machine hall in the middle, which has studio spaces at the first floor, and then all the production spaces underneath. And then on top of that, there are two studio blocks, and the top level has a big series of sawtooth roofs, which allow north-lit studios in, so you get these fantastic day-lit spaces. And then the new building is separated from the existing factory building, which we renovated, by a little laneway between the two, which has become a really interesting space. So on the main front entrance, there's a very formal frontage, which has a lecture theatre up at this level, and a foyer and a gallery underneath. And that's directly on axis with the main machine hall. And then this facade wraps down the long side elevation, integrating with a found building, which wasn't part of our demise, which we've had to integrate. It's a different use altogether. It's a bar and cafe. And then in the middle of the site, we've created this, what we call a big art factory. It's a big 4-story metal-clad structure, which contains all the workshop spaces. It forms quite a compact presence on the back, but the scale of it is made apparent when you see it from a distance. So it's quite a big urban intervention that runs right the way through the urban block, and it links with what we call the gateway studio here, which links the main block with the painting school adjacent to it. And the laneway gets used for all sorts of strange things. I still don't really understand what this guy's doing, but I think he's taking something to a kiln to start some casting. But it has the feel of a proper traditional factory space, and the laneway between it creates a social hub in the center of the site, and the gateway studio bridges over the top, and that's used as a flexible exhibition and seminar space. And then the laneway is closed at night by these gates, which we collaborated with a designer maker called Max Lamb, who was an RCA graduate, to create these multicolored sliding panels, which fold back against the wall and seal the building off at night. So the front facade creates the more formal urban frontage, which is used for events, with the foyer space for the gallery and the foyer space for the lecture theatre above and the gallery below. And there's also a food store down that urban elevation. And then the main circulation spine is created internally by this quite large sculptural staircase, which is freestanding and moves people up through the entrance, past the gallery space, which is behind it, and up to the first floor. And this bottom of the staircase is completely on axis with the main machine hall behind, in the center of the building. This then allows people to climb this staircase or take the lift up to what is the sort of piano nobile level, which is a lecture theatre level, and then you can walk right the way through the building at that point, right the way through the urban block on this glazed walkway, which bridges between the double height spaces on either side of it. So you've got the production spaces below at street level, and then the studio spaces and the circulation at first floor level. The production spaces are very highly serviced. This one's for printmaking. And there's a staircase that links each of the production spaces to the studio spaces above, so that there's a very strong correlation between the idea of designing and making, which happen in the same linked space. So again, you can see here the circulation spine going across the middle. and then the individual works studio spaces connected down to the more production spaces below. So this is ceramics and glass. So people make all the pots and the glass and the kilns are all located below, and the studio spaces are on top. And we designed the thing to really be like a large art factory, not only in the sense of an industrial factory, but also this idea of Warhol's factory of art production. And there's a lot of visibility throughout the building. We worked on this idea of horizontal drift through the building so people could meander through. The existing building that the college is in up in Kensington is a vertical, flatted, multi-story structure. So you've got no real understanding of what's happening above you. This building is much more horizontal, and you can see all the different activities going on between different faculties. And then it's also tucked away are some very highly serviced spaces such as the kiln. So all this industrial activity takes place on the ground and lower ground floor. And then the studio spaces sit above that. And these are much calmer, open, flexible spaces which people use in a more traditional studio way. A lot of them benefit from the large north-lit window on the north facade of the building to provide good levels of daylight. This is the first floor of printmaking. All the services in the building are exposed so that they can be changed, and the building's been designed to be flexible. So in 30 years' time, maybe it could be something else. Maybe it would be a theatre, I don't know, or a bus depot. But there's a lot of flexibility inherent in the design. The painting school, we decided mainly for programmatic reasons not to demolish the existing factory adjacent to the main site, but to regenerate it for studios. And the glazed box pops out. It demarcates the central circulation spine through the building, and also the mezzanine level. So basically, we found that the existing carcass of the building, the windows were at a perfect height for a painting studio, just above head height. And then we just had enough room to put a mezzanine level above that here. And then those studios had north-lit windows sitting on top. So that was the existing factory, very familiar to some of the structures we'd already been working on. So basically took off that roof, kept all the walls, and inserted this new structure inside to create these really tall spaces, which were divided into 6 individual rooms. And this is the sort of cross-section model. So this is a new north-lit roof structure. This is the mezzanine gallery with studio spaces adjacent to it. And these are the existing windows for the side studios. So we've got 2 levels of small studios, and then these large, big rooms which are divided into different spaces. And the building has to function in gallery mode and studio mode. And the high levels of visibility between the spaces are really to try and encourage people to learn from looking at what other people are working on. So when it's clean and empty, it looks like that, but most of the time it looks like this. It smells terrific. The quality of the oil paint in a space like this is fantastic, if you like fumes. And then all the buildings are naturally ventilated as well. So we have these vent cowls in the roofs. So all the air is circulated up through low-level windows and then out through these cowls that project up onto the roof. So this ventilated roof system is used in the new buildings as well as the adapted buildings. There's a lot of use of concrete in the buildings as well. It's a very exposed knockabout building. It's similar to the ones you've got here, I think. And we used it in two ways. One was in situ frames, very strong concrete frames with high floor loadings. And then the other on the right was the use of precast concrete panels, which we had manufactured in Holland by a firm called Docomo. And they're polished granular concrete, exposed aggregate, so it's mixed and then polished up on these big machines. And we used the 2 concretes to sort of play with the formal and the informal in the design of the building. Again, graphics very important in the way that people moved around the building. And there's a graphic designer called Neville Brody, who was quite famous in the 80s in England. He designed magazines called Face and various other things. He's now the head of communications at the Royal College. And he collaborated with the original graphic designer, Margaret Calvert, to create this new font called Calvert Brody. And that's been rolled out through the complex now onto our buildings. So a lot of the signs are stenciled, letters stenciled onto the concrete. are their individual freestanding signs on the outside of the building. The buildings are just about finished now, and it's really interesting to see how they're getting used in practice. Again, it's used as a backdrop for lots of different events. So in the summer, for the shows, it's used as a billboard. A lot of the students appropriate the space for their own exhibitions and use. So every couple of weeks, the building changes its appearance on the inside. And we were quite keen that as a place of production of art, where art is in the constant is in the process of constantly being made. We don't want the building to sort of assert itself and act as an art object in itself. So it takes on a very background role, and then people just inhabit it and use it in whatever way they want. So in some ways it's similar to the theatres, but it's less prescriptive. It's not creating its own theatrical space. It's allowing people to engage with it and use it in a very provisional and loose way. And it also allows them a way for other people to communicate their ideas and opinions, whether you agree with them or not. But it's kind of great to see our buildings being written on and used, particularly at the end of year show. There's always somebody doing something with it. So that brings us on to the final project I want to show you, which again I think is a synthesis of lots of the different themes that I've touched on. It's for the Everyman Theatre in Liverpool, and again it touches on this notion of how do you regenerate a building that people have so much affection for, and it forms such an important cultural part in the life of a city. And in Liverpool, the Everyman is really very culturally important. As a building, it wasn't a great building. It was pretty uncommunicative. It was quite brutal. But as an entity, as a functioning thing, it had a lot of presence. And we were told by a taxi driver when we first went up there, and he knew we were working on it, that we just hadn't to make sure we don't fuck it up, I think was his expression. And I don't think we did, happily. But the building is really just a reworking of the configuration that the previous building had. But in cross-section, it changes dramatically. We've increased the capacity of the building. And again, similar to what we did at the Young Vic, we've put in a proper technical grid at high level. We've also, for the first time for us, created a totally naturally ventilated auditorium. So there are these ducts that come from the outside, bring air into the auditorium, and then the air is exhausted up through these chimneys that sit on the roof of the building at the back. And many of the features of the building, in terms of its long elevation and facade, are very similar to what the existing form of the building was previously like. It had to fit into a very sensitive urban context. This is right opposite the Catholic Cathedral in Liverpool, which is a Grade 1 listed structure. So it had to sort of live against that. And there were also other listed buildings adjacent to it on either side of Hope Street. So we needed to create a building that was sensitive and sympathetic to the context in terms of its scale, but also had more animation and more potential in it for communicating and interacting with the street than the previous building did. These guys on the top of the 4 chimneys that create the natural ventilation, and I don't know whether any of you have been to Liverpool, but they're known for their humour, and those 4 guys have already been nicknamed John, Paul, George and Ringo as part of the Beatles setup. Again, there's a lot of use of in situ concrete in the structure to create this very strong order. This is another collaboration with Anthony Malinowski, the painter we worked with on the Royal Court. He painted most of the ceilings very painstakingly in oil paint. And then in order to make this sort of cultural connection with the building that we were demolishing, we reused all the existing brickwork. So all the brickwork we used in our new structure was found and reclaimed from the existing building. And again, that gives it that continuity, and it blurs that boundary between is it a new building or an old building. We often get asked, what have you done to the building, really? It just feels like it was before. And in many ways it is. But it just has more dynamic to it, has more strength and more architectural clarity than the previous building. This is Anthony's painting close up. It takes him about 3 months to actually get to grips with that. So it's an absolute nightmare in terms of construction, logistics, and builders working around him. But it does create this sort of very warm, strong atmosphere. So this is the main first floor foyer, which creates the sort of piano nobile level at street level. So you can see we're just at first floor, right opposite the sign. You can just see the beginning of the Everyman sign there. And this to us was a really important part of the building because we were making a gesture to the city and linking into this quite sensitive context. We needed a facade that could animate and provide a sort of cultural reference point. So we decided to work as a huge collaboration with people, with Everyman. And I know it sounds really corny, and we had real reservations about whether it was going to work. But we decided to try and work in a way to not just to play on the name, but to play on cultural references of people and buildings. And at Wells Cathedral, there is a whole row of bishops and knights built into the building. And then a lot of primitive art that you get in the north, like Lowry and various other artists, have used people to form movement and pattern, but in quite an abstract way. And then we also looked at references where you get repetition of the same element to create a grain and its texture. So this is a series of coats in I think it was in Vienna, pre-war, where a guy was just interested in advertising what he did. So he created this facade out of coats, and we thought that could be an incredible reference point. As were some more industrial buildings, which use panels and louvers to provide animation, and this idea of variable shading, because the facade that we had also had to shade the building behind, which was a predominantly glazed facade. So we enrolled the good people of Liverpool, and we got 105 selected to have their photograph taken to create an image in each one of the panels. And then the panels were digitized, and we had to experiment with this to get it to work. But it was it's a sort of negative positive thing. So the idea is you take the person and then digitally process it in order to go through a negative positive feedback. It's a little bit like a film negative, and then you create a positive image when you actually make it in full size. So we went from sort of small digital desktop models of 1 to 100 up to much bigger prototypes to test the lighting and the clarity, and then created these etchings, which when you're close up you really can't see it. The image is very difficult to read. It's cut from 12mm thick aluminium panels, water jet cut. But then when you move away from it, you begin to see the texture and the pattern of the individual person. And then we designed this moving device that enabled each panel to have a variable rotation with a sort of arc. It's a very simple mechanical arc pivot. So this is sort of where the low-tech meets the high-tech, really, between the two systems. And then they merged together to create this very animated facade, which creates the street edge, and the life of the building then permeates back out through the glazed wall. The signage was based on the signage in the original building, and Jake Tilson, who we've worked with on a few things, redid the graphics and created this new font. So a little bit like the Neville Brody stuff on the Dyson, he created this new font, which is a stretched version of the Everyman. And it's proved to be a really, really powerful image. And again, something that we just did very lightly in the earlier projects where we used signs as part of the architecture. This one actually, although it doesn't say theatre, it says Everyman. It creates this real strong identity to the building. And the building also works a little bit like the Young Vic. It works in different modes. So in the daytime, it's predominantly shiny and silver. And then at night, it becomes illuminated and picks up on all the colours going on inside it. So that's a sort of range of things that we've been involved in. I've put this back up really just to go back to the beginning. It was a very powerful image, this, to both myself and Steve Tompkins when we started the practice. I remember it being on the front of Progressive Architecture must have been 78, 79, something like that. And I always use it as a touchstone to how architecture has this transformative power, and it doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be commercial or glamorous. It can actually be really domestic, really small scale, but just have an attitude and approach to it. And I think somehow we would like to keep in touch with that sensibility in the stuff that we do. the other image is really about adaptation and transformation and how we strive to create buildings that, if possible, are as tough as some of the old warehouse buildings you get in cities. I mean, this is, I think this is Spring Street in Manhattan some time ago. And the idea that buildings take on a different use, they change, they go in and out of focus, they get appropriated or misappropriated for graffiti, and then suddenly they're gentrified. And I think what's missing in this is what happens to number 11, the building further over. In future, does it go back to be graffitied? Does it become demolished? There's a cycle, a sort of cultural continuity, really, in architecture, which is really important to sort of get to grips with. And then the final image is really just this idea of how do you change and adapt buildings when their previous raison d'etre has moved. This is an image we used for the competition entry for the Royal Court Theatre. And the only way we could really get across the fact that we've really got to sort of mess about with your building is to draw cartoon spectacles onto the audience of a Victorian theatre to say this is sort of what we think we're dealing with. So this is about us as architects trying to communicate the idea of developing a brief with a client to try and understand a building, to try and understand what the cultural shift is in what you're doing. So in a way, this is also a bit of a touchstone for us about that line of inquiry that I've hopefully tried to describe before. And also, it enables you to just keep a sense of humour in all this, because it's a bit of a long journey doing any of this work, as you will appreciate from your student work. It doesn't get any easier, but it's really rewarding and really enjoyable. And I hope this has given you a bit of a glimpse of what we're doing on the other side of the Atlantic. And I want to end on one word: is we never get any American students coming to our office. We have Canadians, Japanese, Germans, and for some reason we never manage to attract the best American students. So if any of you ever want to risk it and come over, there's plenty of opportunities there. Thank you very much. Oh, okay. First step here.
So we've got some time for some discussion, some questions, comments. Who wants to start? It was great. It's so rare that we get to see someone who's dealing with historical context and the kind of everyday, but also producing tremendous contemporary architecture as a response to that. So I think it was quite new and a treat for us here. There's got to be questions about it.
Thank you so much. I just enjoyed everything in your talk. Especially, I think, the way in which you really, your work shows such a clear love for the city, for the cultural memory, but also an absolute optimism about the future and where things go. I thought it was really interesting I kept having a lot of flashbacks. I appreciated your showing us your influences early on, and I kept having more and more flashbacks to especially all the phrases from Venturi, the messy vitality, the ugly and the ordinary instead of the heroic and the original, the decorated shed. I mean, all of these kind of tropes at a certain point. But I thought it was interesting that, you end with Gehry, certainly the early Gehry. I'm wondering if you could comment on, because I think it's easy to be critical of kind of what Venturi and Scott Brown proposed versus quite where their architecture went. And I would say, boy, you managed to take the best from them, and I think go way beyond where they sort of fell short in some of their the attitude, the actual making. But I'd also say you've stayed more true to Gehry's early work and then his later work also just in no way lived up. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that sort of, what is it about their early work and what could the students be kind of learning? Because I think most students now are just looking at late Gehry, not early.
Yeah. I think probably Venturi is a reference that should have been up there, actually. It's sort of well spotted. Yeah, it's just this idea of... I think in theory they were all really ahead of their time in terms of what they were talking about. Decorated sheds, learning from Las Vegas, all that sort of stuff. I think Rem Koolhaas has picked up on it a little bit now with his ideas of junk space, and he does it in a very Dutch way, but he's still tapping back into that sort of complexity and contradiction stuff. I think as a practitioner, and I think we're facing it now, is that, when you've got an office of 60 people, it's quite a lot of mouths to feed. You get clients that want a bit of this, but don't understand that it takes a kind of attitude and a bit of sacrifice to get it. So the numbers always don't always add up. The time you've got to put into it doesn't always stack up. And as a business model, it's probably not a fantastic proposition, actually, to work in that way. So you can see why people get drawn into that sort of Faustian pact where they become attracted by big tower blocks and big buildings, because in a way, they think they're still doing the sort of complexity of work that they were doing in their early work. And they're probably just doing it on a larger scale, but there's something goes. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, but it is a concern, and it's a real worry about how you hang on to that naivety or that original attitude. And I think you've just got to keep it in focus and keep, that's why the punk thing is quite interesting. The reason we put the music on at the beginning is that whenever I listen to that music, it always reminds me that you don't sell out, you don't change your value systems, and okay, you become a boring old fart maybe, but you carry on doing the same stuff. And I think it's so easy to just fall into sort of commercial pressures. I think creatively, they changed. I don't think they became any less creative. I've heard lots of stories about Venturi threatening to walk off the National Theatre because they wouldn't Prince Charles wanted one more column or something, and he didn't want another column, he didn't want it to hit the ground. He was still working brain-wise really, really hard. I just think it's so difficult. It's easier, I think, in architecture to stay in touch. I mean, Kahn didn't start till he was 70, and Korb was still doing really well than it is in being in a rock band. So, I mean, we've got that advantage, but I think you just got to work at it, I think. I don't know the answer to, I don't know the answer to your question really about why people change and why their earlier work is more interesting, but for me it just seems to be somehow. And I'm hoping this isn't going to be classed as our earlier work. I think we've probably burst through a little bit of a middle territory, and what we're concerned about now is where we take, where we take it. It's also quite difficult to learn as well. It's quite difficult for myself and Steve to sort of communicate to people who work with us how to do it, because it's a little bit like method acting. You are in a way making it up as you go along. You are having to use your intuition somehow, and it can go quite quickly if somebody makes a wrong move. So the bigger the projects are, the less you're involved in the direct authorship of it, and I think that's sort of the Venturi and Geary issue as well, that you tend to lose touch, and you think it looks okay, but actually you're not as hands-on as you probably were.
Yeah, maybe just taking off from this last point, which implies a kind of improvisational approach to juxtaposing interventions relative to existing conditions. Because it's quite the sensibility that you describe. I mean, it's very painterly in a way, in terms of a sense of, on the one hand, sort of the potential for the phenomenal depth of a surface,
yeah.
And this a collagist sensibility, a sense of the way in which time is layered into surfaces and so on. It also implies something, I think, about urban plan making or urban interventionist strategies. So I'm observing all that. I saw the Young Vic installation at the Biennale 4 years ago, and I can't wait to go look up my images that I took of that. But my question is really, how do you go about cultivating that sensibility amongst the people who come to work for you, and I should say maybe more specifically, amongst clients, amidst client groups, or where a client is a complex entity? Or do they just come to you because they already have that orientation?
On the student side, we don't teach, basically. And I think we do our teaching through our studio. So it's a little bit like an apprenticeship thing. So we have a lot of young architects, graduates, Part 1 graduates who work with us, and a lot of them stay for more than the 1 year. We do a year out in the UK where you do your degree, and before you do postgrad, you do a year in industry. And a lot of them stay for 1, 2, 3 years because they're actually learning. So it's a very much an atelier-based studio, and we are teaching them what we do through osmosis, I suppose, and practice. The client thing, I think we have been very lucky in the sort of clients that we've attracted, but we've also put ourselves in a position that has attracted us to those clients in a way by making sure that we deal with the things that you set out, really. We haven't courted commercial clients. We just have no success there at all. But we've been really lucky in getting creative people to work with. So on the theatre side, we've worked with most of the major theatre directors in the UK over the last 15, 20 years. On the art side, we've built up a big reputation there and worked collaboratively with a lot of artists and also now through the Royal College, a lot of makers and creative thinkers there. I think there's a danger that it can dry up. I don't know whether it's infinitesimal, but what we are finding is that people are coming to us to more commercial clients that we don't have that synergy with are coming to us, and we are having difficulty actually sort of locking. And we've got some quite big schemes going through now where we are having to work really hard to say, no, we can't do that. And the reason we can't do that is because we have to do it in this way and think about it in this way. And it's taken a lot more energy than when you have like-minded guys who are working in a similar way. And I think we've got to be a bit careful with this, actually. I think it's a project that you have to work on and be aware of it. And again, it's the thing I was just describing earlier, the balance between scale of office. If you get to a certain point, if we took the work that we're being offered, I think in 2 years' time we wouldn't see what we see now. We'd see something different, and we're consciously trying to limit that back. And 60 people is probably a bit too big, and we need to sort of pull it back. But it's impractical for us to go back to designing our own letterhead again, where we started. So, you have to sort of find a balance. I think we've sort of got it, but it takes more and more time to secure that. We are in the studio. We've created a group of people where we've promoted up into quite important positions in the studio who've been with us a long time as well. So we've formed a sort of culture there, which helps. But no, you have to work at it, I think, is the answer to it.
How did you first start collaborating with the arts in the process in the last 35 years?
We used to, we never used to hang out with architects, really. We're sort of phobic about being part of a big architects gang, so we just used to hang out with people that we were interested in talking to. So in the artist side, there was a big movement called the Brit Art thing, which is the whole Damien Hirst thing and Tracy Emin, and basically they were all part of a group, and you could just hang around and go to parties and drink with people like that. It was totally accessible because nobody had any money, nobody was doing anything. They were just driven by this sort of creative thing. So that's how you got to know people. And then when you had something to offer, like if you had a building and you wanted to work with somebody, you just mentioned it to them. So with the stuff with Martin Creed, we just said, do you fancy doing this thing? And he almost pulled out, actually, because he wasn't sure whether it was the right thing to do. And then once we got over that, we've done about 5 or 6 things with him. Anthony, he's somebody we've known for a long time, the guy who paints the surfaces. And then on the theatre side, we do quite a lot of work, like pro bono work, where we do sketch proposals for temporary stuff for up-and-coming theatre groups and things like that. So it's a case of just like working in a sort of area, and slowly you get to know them. And they're incredibly approachable. I don't know any artist who wouldn't collaborate if you set it up correctly. So in some cases, it's just a case of ringing them up and asking them if they're interested in doing things. And the best artist I've worked with personally was Dan Graham, and we were asked to work with him because at the Haworth Gallery they wanted to build this elliptical entrance, and they commissioned him to do it, and he needed somebody to facilitate that. So it's a little bit like the Dyer Center in New York, and he was incredible to work with, and he's very interested in architecture. He's like an architectural tourist, really. And he's really knows all the sort of trends that are really worth looking at. So, you know, he introduced me to Atelier Bow Wow in Japan, who I'd never heard of at the time, and he's also interested in some very obscure Scandinavian architects as well. So I think it's all about dialogue and communication and sort of hanging around with people that you want to think creatively with. And unfortunately, hanging around with a lot of architects isn't a great way of doing that, because we all think in the same way. So you have to sort of marginalize yourself in some way and create an area that you want to work in. So it might be artists, it might be makers. I mean, I'm really excited by the potential of digital production and making things. And you know, so if you know a furniture maker, why not build something with him? And there's a big movement in the UK at the moment where architects are younger architects who probably didn't have the sort of opportunities that we had are now setting up their own entrepreneurial thing. So there are groups like Assemble, who actually won the Turner Prize, which is an artist prize this year. And they just get out there and they build things under urban flyovers and on derelict plots and things like that. And they collaborate with like-minded people. I think it's a lot easier than you think, actually, getting a good collaboration together. One here.
In a way, you kind of touched on answering a question I was going to ask, but I remember Gary saying that he appreciated the New York Five, but he didn't think their work was relevant in the same way that what he was doing was. And you can imagine, I saw Gary's installation at the Biennale in '82, and I remember it. And it really still stands. And you can imagine that it was a response to a lack of craft in the United States. Yeah. And he actually made that a virtue in his own work. Yeah. And of course, he was alluding to artists like Rauschenberg. And yeah. What's remarkable about Gary, that you see this so rarely, is that lightning struck twice. That he actually did have a second career. And in a way, he did it again because he intuited then on the one hand, there was no craft, say, in American production, especially for the houses. And then he intuited that there would be zero tolerance craft as a possibility to do with economics. And I just want, by the way, I really appreciate your presentation, everything, the artists that you collaborate with. But I'm just wondering if you thought about that a little bit more, how in your work, given your trajectory, how you would incorporate more aggressively digital fabrication, but in maybe even parametric ideas.
Yeah, we have started to go into that area. The pure parametrics didn't interest us at first, because it led to a form making that was generated by the parametrics. What we've tried to do is use the technology now to work in I think that this idea of lo-fi, if you could imagine a lo-fi analog version of hi-fi digital, that's the sort of territory that we're interested in that. So we've started using the Revit system in three-dimensional modeling, but we're using that to make our buildings in the way that we creatively would fabricate them and make them. But we are trying to advance a lot of our stuff is craft-based, I think, is sort of the thing. So we need to try and use the technology to make the craft economical, because otherwise it gets too expensive and too prohibitive. So like the screen on the Everyman is very much a craft-based object, really. But it's using high production techniques to make it economic. In terms of specific, in terms of having to reinvent a creative process, I think the getting lucky was him moving over into digital technology with the French digital computer system, I think is what you're referring to. So he could actually make his buildings, and we haven't quite got a handle on what that next step might be. I think it's a very interesting question that we need to think about, because there's definite possibilities of technology maybe liberating us from the sort of the potential dead end, that we may be reaching to move into another area. We haven't really explored. So I think I'm probably taking your question as a sort of helpful prompt to go away and think about it. But it would be nice to think that you could continually reinvent the way you work, actually.
I'm sorry to everyone else to ask a second question, but one of the issues, I think, over the years, there have always been students who have been really interested in adaptive reuse. I think, here in Atlanta, there's not a single exciting, hip, desirable restaurant that isn't an adaptive reuse project, because there's just so that craving for something authentic, something that has a character that is not just that sort of instant new thing is quite real, especially in young cities and places like Atlanta. And yet, so there's a recognition of how much I think there's a great love for those really great adaptive reuse projects. And yet, it's often so hard to produce, especially in school, drawings that look sexy in any way. Yep. And so there's this sort of default too, the parametrics driving the rendering. Yeah. And yet it's so completely distant from the authenticity of the kind of, I think, work that you've shown us. So you showed us plans and sections and then the photographs of the actual real buildings. I'm guessing, and I'm just projecting, but that you've got clients who somehow you're able to dampen their expectations for the rendering, which is so much of what school has sort of, portfolios, we're all trying, that's become so much of the emphasis. Do you have advice for the students who want to do adaptive reuse? How do they what do they put in their portfolio? How do we do it? How do you do it?
Well, collage is a good medium, actually sort of sticking stuff together and gluing it. And we use a lot of that. We build a lot of models. I mean, rather than spend an inordinate amount of time doing a CGI rendering, it might be better to use the computer to create digital maps that you can get laser cut or rapid prototyped. So actually use the technology to experiment with the form. I think if you can sort of explore this notion of trying to use real high digital technology in a lo-fi way, a crude way. So some programs are just too complex for their own good in a way, unless you want to go straight into production and make it. So things like really crude systems like SketchUp or Photoshop or something like that are good ways of doing it. There was a big competition that was just won in London recently, and there were 6 entries, and I think all 6 entries had massive CGIs. I mean, the megabytes of memory that must have produced those were phenomenal, and the winning entry was a series of watercolors drawn by hand, and it was just so refreshing to see that medium. So in a way, if you can sort of demystify the CGI, so make it cruder, make it more provisional, and it must be easier to do as well, I would have thought, if you have to spend less time doing it. But I think it is a bit of a difficult one in terms of trying to create an appropriate form of representation for something that isn't going to be fully realized until you build it, and it's just finding that sort of methodology. But models, I think you can't beat models. We build models this big, and photograph them, and then put them into Photoshop and work them, and then maybe you drop that into a CGI that deals with context or something. But no, it would be an interesting studio project, I think, to try and pull back from high production values and see what you get out of it. In a way, that's what the Biennale exhibition was, really. There were lots of people working in quite low-tech ways, like Studio Mumbai from India actually built something out of bricks, made it, and it took them ages, and the first one collapsed, and they had to build it again. But just this idea of architecture having authenticity. And I think in Atlanta, I know what you mean, that it's trying to lock onto things like the Beltline and the Sears building and all that sort of stuff that's being changed. But that is good. It's good in a way. But also, if you could find a way of using the sort of the clean slate that you've got, and try and because in some ways our work comes out of constraints. It comes out of the fact that we can't push, we can't build this new thing. We have to work with these constraints. Whereas you have an opportunity, I think, as well for new.
I think that what you hit on is an issue, because the slate is never clean. Right? It just has to do with what one values.
Yeah.
What one chooses to see as being significant. And so if one chooses to say it's a clean slate, then one will proceed accordingly. So that's, to me, that's at the level of learning how to love the city, any city, is to figure out what are the layers, both present and imminent, in a place.
Because I can see some great opportunities in what I called your clean slate. I mean, because it does have context, it does have a lot of probity. It's just trying to tap into what those right moves are, I think.
So this is a great conversation. Maybe one more question, and then I know it's getting late in the semester. If people are anxious to get back to studio. If there's not a final question, then maybe I'll ask just one, sort of throw this out there and let you swing away. How does, and it's really kind of a reaction to a lot of these questions, how does material play into your work? I mean, talking about collage as a material, either through the kind of rendering of a material, thinking about the layers of material in an existing sort of found condition, and the way in which you go in and intervene within that material condition.
Yeah, well, a lot of it stems from the fact that our stuff's about making. So therefore, you need to understand the materials that you're making the stuff out of. So does it have weight? How do you fix it? How do you put it together? So there's a continual R&D project for us, really, is pushing boundaries of materials. We're trying to work with them. We've formalized that now. We've taken on a PhD student from the Royal College who's working in textiles. So she's going to come into the studio for 12 months to work on fabric, because we're finding we're doing a lot of stuff with textiles and fabric. So it's a bit like the revelation of signage and lighting for us. We've suddenly found fabrics. So this idea that we will be working on materiality there, because we think we know enough about steel and bricks and concrete potentially, but there are other areas of materiality, like softer materials, that we're thinking of looking at. But it really informs the it answers that question about how do you bridge that gap. You know, if you're working with existing buildings and adapting them, how do you keep that cultural memory alive? And often the materiality is the link. So the tiles in the butcher's shop wouldn't be the same if they were just paint. You know, so you've got to understand the sort of phenomenology of the materials as much as what they are in terms of stuff. You know, in terms of building materials, they have some are warm, some are cold, some are intimidating, some are welcoming, and it's that sort of whole phenomenology of what a material can do is interesting to us, as well as how you put things together. And that again, I mean, it almost feels like you need to come back to college to research that yourself, doesn't it? Actually, quite envious of people having time to do that.
I think maybe that's where some of the rendering that you're talking about lays flat, is that lack of understanding of materiality, which is what architecture is made out of, right? So on that note, if we could, let them applause.
Thank you very much.